Sometimes the
The
person
snow
who
is
changes your
beautiful
life
today.
forever is
It
the one
really
you
is.
almost never meet.
I'm glad we came
Snow
out.
drifted across the streets of Chicago in slow white waves, softening the city's sharp edges and turning the late evening into a blur of headlights and reflections. Ava Bennett tightened her worn gray coat and hurried along the sidewalk, her boots crunching through slush as she glanced anxiously at the glowing clock above a corner pharmacy. 9:12 p.m. Her heart sank. She was running late. Again. The public library where she worked part-time had stayed open an extra hour because of the storm, and now every minute felt heavier than the last. Tomorrow morning was supposed to be important. More important than anything she had faced in months. A final interview for a full-time administrative position at a nonprofit organization. Real health insurance. Stable pay. A chance to stop juggling bills like a circus performer balancing glass plates. A
I've
chance to
missed
finally
this.
breathe. Ava pushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear
Me
and quickened
too.
her pace. The icy wind slapped against her cheeks.
The snow is
She could
beautiful
already see the
today.
bus stop
It
half
really
a block
is.
away. A few
glad
people
we came
stood
out.
beneath the shelter, huddled against the cold. Relief
I
flickered
had a
inside
wonderful
her
time
chest.
with you tonight.
Maybe she would
I'll
make
see you
it.
tomorrow.
Then she heard it, the low rumble of an engine, the squeak of brakes releasing. Her eyes widened.
I'm honored to share
No,
our vision for
no,
future
no,
innovations
no.
with you today.
The city bus pulled away from the curb
Together, we
just
can
as she
unlock
broke into a
unprecedented
run.
possibilities.
Wait, she
I
shouted
remember
instinctively.
using these when I was a
The
kid.
words
Look
disappeared
at that
into the wind.
price.
The driver
Wow.
never looked back.
They are
The
beautiful.
bus rolled
I love
forward,
the old
its
typography.
taillights glowing red through the snowfall before vanishing around the corner. Ava slowed to a stop. Her shoulders dropped. For several seconds, she simply stood there, breathing hard while snowflakes melted against her eyelashes. That had been the last express route of the night. The next bus would not arrive for nearly 90 minutes. 90 minutes she could not afford to lose. She looked up at the dark sky. Seriously, she muttered. The frustration wasn't really about the bus. It was about everything. The overdue electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter. The stack of medical statements from her mother's cardiologist. The landlord who had started leaving increasingly less friendly notes on her apartment door. The constant feeling that no matter how hard she worked, life kept moving the finish line a little farther away. Ava wrapped her arms around herself and stepped beneath the shelter. Most of the passengers had already disappeared. Only one person remained. A man standing near the far end of the bench. He appeared to be in his early 30s. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark brown hair dusted with snow. His coat looked old enough to have seen several winters, and a knitted scarf covered part of his jaw. He wasn't scrolling through his phone like everyone else usually did. Instead, he was staring out at the street as if he were lost in thought. Ava barely noticed him at first. She was too busy calculating how much an Uber would cost and how little money she currently had. The answer made her stomach tighten. Not happening. She opened her purse anyway. Inside sat exactly $23 and some loose change. $23 until payday. $23 that needed to stretch through groceries, gas, and a prescription refill for her mother. She sighed and reached for the small laminated card tucked behind her wallet. The edges were worn from years of handling. Her monthly bus pass from long ago. Expired now. Useless, technically. Yet she carried it everywhere. Written on the back in faded black ink were two words. Keep going. Her father's handwriting. The last thing he had written for her before his sudden heart attack 8 years earlier. Whenever life felt impossible, she looked at those words. Keep going. Ava smiled faintly and slipped the card back into her purse. When she looked up again, the stranger was watching her. Not in a rude way. More like he had noticed something sad and wasn't sure whether to ask about it. Their eyes met briefly. He offered a polite nod. Ava nodded back. Then both looked away. A blast of cold air swept through the shelter. The stranger glanced toward the road, checked his watch, and finally spoke. Looks like we both missed it. His voice was calm, warm despite the weather. Ava laughed softly. Looks like it. Next bus isn't for a while. An hour and a half. You've checked already. 3 times. That earned a small smile from him. For the first time all evening, Ava felt herself smile back. Neither of them knew it yet, but the missed bus wasn't the problem. It was the beginning. A few minutes passed while snow continued drifting across the empty street. Cars moved slowly through the storm, their headlights cutting pale paths through the darkness before disappearing again. Ava rubbed her hands together, trying to restore feeling to her fingers. The stranger glanced down the road one more time before pulling a phone from his coat pocket. Unlike most phones she saw these days, it was simple. No flashy case. No visible logo. He studied the screen for a moment and frowned. That is not good, he said quietly. Ava tilted her head. What happened? He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The weather is getting worse. Several routes are being delayed. Ava sighed. Perfect. You have somewhere important to be? For a moment she considered giving the usual answer people expected. Nothing much. Just heading home. But something about his calm voice made honesty feel easier than pretending. I have a job interview tomorrow morning. Congratulations. She laughed softly. Not yet. I still have to survive the interview. You will. You sound very confident. You seem like someone who keeps showing up even when things get difficult. The words caught her off guard. Most people did not notice things like that. Most people barely noticed her at all. Ava looked away, suddenly embarrassed. Well, life does not really give me much choice. The stranger nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. For several seconds neither spoke. The city felt unusually quiet. Then a gust of wind swept snow into the shelter. Ava shivered. The stranger looked toward the nearly empty parking lot across the street. This might sound strange, he said, but I rented a car earlier today. It is parked over there. We are heading toward the same side of town. If you want, we could share the ride. Ava blinked. Her first instinct was caution. Every warning she had ever heard immediately surfaced in her mind. Do not get into cars with strangers. Do not trust people you do not know. Yet the alternative was standing in freezing weather for another 90 minutes. The stranger seemed to sense her hesitation. You do not have to decide right away, he said. I only thought I would offer. Ava studied him carefully. His expression remained relaxed. No pressure. No impatience. Just an offer. You are not secretly an axe murderer, are you? She asked. The question escaped before she could stop it. For the first time, he laughed. It was genuine and surprisingly warm. No. At least I do not think so. Ava found herself laughing too. That sounds exactly like something an axe murderer would say. Fair point. Another silence followed, but this one felt lighter somehow. Less awkward. More comfortable. Finally, Ava glanced at the storm swirling beyond the shelter. How much? She asked. For what? The ride. Nothing. She immediately shook her head. No. Absolutely not. It is on my way. Still no. The stranger considered this. Then buy me a cup of coffee someday. Ava raised an eyebrow. Someday. If we happen to run into each other again. She smiled despite herself. That is a pretty optimistic plan. I am an optimistic person. In Chicago? It is my greatest flaw. Ava laughed again. Before she could overthink it, she nodded. Okay. Shared ride. The stranger stood and extended a hand. Ethan. Ava shook it. His grip was firm but respectful. Ava. Together they stepped back into the snow. The parking lot was nearly deserted except for a handful of vehicles dusted white. Ethan led her toward a modest dark blue sedan. Nothing expensive. Nothing attention-grabbing. Just practical. He unlocked the doors and waited for her to get inside before walking around to the driver's side. Warm air gradually filled the cabin as the heater came to life. Ava released a grateful sigh. This might be the best feeling in the world. Ethan smiled as he adjusted the controls. Heat usually ranks pretty high during Chicago winters. The windshield wipers swept away a fresh layer of snow. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan pulled onto the road. Streetlights reflected across the glass while the city rolled past outside. The ride began quietly. Comfortable. Unhurried. Ava watched the snowflakes dance through the beams of light. Something about the evening felt strange. Not bad strange. Just unexpected. An hour ago, she had been racing toward a bus. Now she was sharing a car with a man she had met less than 10 minutes earlier. Life had a funny way of rewriting plans. Neither of them knew it yet, but before this night was over, a simple ride home would become the beginning of a story neither could have imagined. For the first 15 minutes, the drive felt surprisingly easy. Snow drifted across the windshield in soft waves while the heater hummed quietly between them. Outside, Chicago seemed wrapped in white and silver, the usual noise of the city muted by the storm. Ava watched storefronts slide past and found herself relaxing for the first time all day. Ethan drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, his attention fixed on the road ahead. He did not seem like someone in a hurry. He did not seem like someone trying to impress anyone either. That alone made him different from most people Ava had met lately. So, Ethan said eventually, "What kind of job is the interview for?" Ava smiled. "Administrative coordinator." "Sounds important." "That is a generous description." You do not sound excited. I am excited. I am terrified too. Ethan glanced at her briefly. Why? Ava stared out the passenger window. Because I need it. The answer came more quickly than she intended. She hesitated, then continued. I mean really need it. Ethan nodded but did not interrupt. Somehow that made it easier to keep talking. My mother has a heart condition. Insurance covers some things. Not everything. She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Apparently hearts are expensive. Ethan's expression softened. I am sorry. Me too. The words hung between them for a moment. She is doing okay? Ava added quickly. At least that is what she keeps telling me. And you do not believe her? Ava smiled sadly. I think parents spend half their lives pretending they are fine so their kids do not worry. Ethan looked thoughtful. That sounds accurate. The snow grew heavier. Visibility decreased. Cars ahead slowed to a crawl. Red brake lights stretched through the darkness like glowing beads on a string. Ethan eased off the accelerator. Looks like everyone had the same idea tonight. Ava checked the time. As long as we keep moving, I am happy. For a while they sat in comfortable silence. Then Ethan noticed something sticking out of her purse. A small laminated card. The same one she had looked at earlier. Can I ask about that? He said carefully. Ava followed his gaze and immediately knew what he meant. She pulled out the worn bus pass and smiled. This? You looked at it back at the bus stop. She ran her thumb across the faded surface. It is silly. The important things usually are. Ava laughed. Then she turned the card over. Ethan noticed the faded handwriting, but could not read the words from where he sat. My father gave it to me years ago. Her voice became softer. I was 16. Things were difficult. We were struggling financially. I remember complaining that everything felt impossible. She looked down at the card. The next morning I found this tucked into my backpack. Ethan waited. What does it say? Ava smiled. Keep going. Ethan felt something tighten unexpectedly inside his chest. 2 simple words. Yet the way she said them made them feel heavier. More valuable. Good advice, he said quietly. The best advice I ever received. She slipped the card back into her purse. Sometimes I think it is the only reason I made it through some years. Outside, the storm suddenly intensified. Wind pushed against the car. Snow swirled across the road in thick, white sheets. Ethan frowned and reduced speed even further. A warning light flickered briefly on the dashboard, then disappeared. He glanced at it. Ava noticed. Everything okay? Probably. Probably. Ethan smiled. That was not reassuring, was it? Before she could answer, another warning light flashed. This time it stayed on. Ethan's smile faded slightly. Interesting. Interesting is never a good word when someone is driving. Ethan laughed. You may have a point. The engine made a strange sound. Not loud, just enough to catch his attention. He carefully guided the car toward the shoulder. What happened? Ava asked. I am not entirely sure. The sedan rolled forward another 50 yards before losing power completely. The engine fell silent. Only the wind remained. For several seconds neither spoke. Snow tapped gently against the windows. Ava looked through the windshield at the nearly deserted road stretching ahead. Then she looked at Ethan. Please tell me this is part of some exciting adventure package included with the ride. Ethan leaned back in his seat and sighed dramatically. Unfortunately, it is the budget version. Ava burst out laughing. Ethan joined her. Neither of them could explain why the situation felt funny instead of frustrating. Maybe because they were already stranded. Maybe because there was nothing else to do. Through the swirling snow, a small gas station appeared about 100 yards away. Its neon sign glowed faintly against the storm. Ethan pointed toward it. Well, Ava followed his gaze. At least we are not completely abandoned. That feels optimistic. I told you. It is my greatest flaw. Ethan grabbed his coat. Ava reached for hers. Together they stepped out into the freezing night, unaware that the unexpected stop ahead would reveal more about each of them than either had planned to share. The blast of cold air hit them the moment they stepped out of the car. Snow swirled around their legs while the neon sign of the gas station flickered in the distance like a lighthouse in a storm. Ava pulled her coat tighter and followed Ethan across the icy pavement. By the time they reached the front door, both were covered in a fresh layer of snow. The small station looked as though it had been standing there for decades. Warm yellow lights spilled through the windows. Inside, a handful of customers sat scattered around a diner counter while an old coffee machine hissed in the corner. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread wrapped around them instantly. Ava sighed with relief. I think I just fell in love with central heating, she said. Ethan laughed. I was worried you were going to say the coffee. The coffee has not earned that kind of commitment yet. They found a booth near the window. Outside, the storm continued to build. Snowflakes drifted against the glass while the highway beyond slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of white. A waitress approached carrying 2 menus. She looked tired but friendly. Kitchen is still open if you want something warm, she said. Ava immediately reached for the cheapest items on the menu. Ethan noticed. He also noticed the way she paused before ordering, mentally calculating every dollar. Just coffee for me, Ava said. The waitress nodded and looked toward Ethan. Coffee and 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, Ethan replied. Ava turned toward him. You do not have to do that. I know. Seriously. Ava. His expression remained calm. You are stranded in a snowstorm. I am stranded in a snowstorm. If civilization collapses tonight, I would prefer to face it with grilled cheese. Ava laughed despite herself. That is surprisingly reasonable. A few minutes later the food arrived. Ava had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite. The warmth spread through her instantly. For the next several minutes conversation flowed more naturally than before. The strange formality that existed between strangers began to fade. They talked about favorite movies, terrible jobs they had worked, and the worst winter storms they could remember. Ethan discovered that Ava possessed a quiet sense of humor that appeared when she least expected it. Ava discovered that Ethan listened more than he talked. In a world full of people waiting for their turn to speak, that felt rare. Eventually, Ethan stirred his coffee and asked, "What would you do if money was not a problem?" Ava looked surprised. That is a dangerous question. Why? Because it lets people dream. Ethan smiled. Exactly. She thought for a moment. I would probably open a community reading center. A reading center? Books helped me through a lot growing up. I always thought every kid should have a place where they could feel safe, warm, and welcome. Ethan studied her quietly. Most people answer questions like that with vacations, cars, or luxury homes. Ava's dream involved helping strangers. What about you? She asked. Ethan looked toward the snow outside. For a brief second, he almost told her the truth. He almost told her about boardrooms, investors, private jets, and a company worth more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Instead, he smiled lightly. I am between jobs right now. Ava narrowed her eyes suspiciously. That is not what I asked. Ethan laughed. Fair enough. He considered his answer carefully. I think I would want to build something that actually improves people's lives. That sounds vague. Maybe because I am still figuring it out. Ava nodded slowly. The answer seemed honest, even if incomplete. Outside, the storm intensified again. Wind pushed against the windows hard enough to make them rattle. The waitress walked by and shook her head. Road crews are saying conditions are getting worse. Some routes are already closing. Ava glanced toward the highway. Her stomach tightened. Looks like we are going to be here a while. Ethan followed her gaze. Strangely, neither of them seemed upset by that possibility. The conversation resumed. Minutes became an hour. Stories turned into confidences. Ava spoke about losing her father at 16 and the responsibility she felt afterward. Ethan spoke carefully about success, expectations, and the loneliness that sometimes came from carrying responsibilities no one else could see. He never mentioned his company. He never mentioned the fortune. Yet for the first time in a long while, he found himself speaking honestly. Near midnight, Ava excused herself to call her mother. Ethan watched from across the diner as she stood near the entrance, smiling warmly into her phone despite obvious exhaustion. He noticed the way her expression softened when she spoke. The way she reassured her mother instead of burdening her with worries. The way she laughed, even when life gave her plenty of reasons not to. Something about that stayed with him. When Ava returned to the booth, Ethan looked away quickly. Everything okay? He asked. She smiled. Yeah. She wanted to make sure I was safe. Ethan nodded. Mothers tend to do that. Ava settled back into her seat. Neither of them realized it yet, but somewhere between the missed bus, the broken car, and the diner coffee, two strangers had already become something more important than either intended. By the time the storm finally began to weaken, it was well past midnight. The diner had grown quieter. One customer after another paid their bill and disappeared into the snowy night until only a few people remained. Ava glanced at the clock above the counter and let out a slow breath. There goes my plan of getting 8 hours of sleep before the interview. Ethan smiled. Maybe you only need 7. That is not how interviews work. You seem very sure about that. Trust me, every interview has a secret rule that says candidates must arrive looking energetic and well-rested, even if life is actively working against them. Ethan laughed softly. I think you will survive. Ava leaned back in the booth and studied him for a moment. The more they talked, the more curious she became. There was something unusual about Ethan. He carried himself differently than most people she knew. Not arrogantly, not proudly, just with a quiet confidence that seemed impossible to fake. It was the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions. Someone used to responsibility. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. What did you do before your break from work? Ethan took a sip of coffee, buying himself a few seconds. Business. Ava narrowed her eyes. That is suspiciously vague. I warned you. I am still figuring things out. People who are figuring things out usually do not sound that calm. Ethan smiled. Maybe I am very good at pretending. Ava considered that answer. For reasons she could not explain, it felt true. Not the words themselves. The pretending part. As if there were things about him he was deliberately keeping hidden. Before she could ask another question, movement near the entrance caught her attention. An elderly man stepped through the door carrying a snow-covered toolbox. His jacket looked thin for the weather. The station manager greeted him immediately. Carl, your truck's still not starting? The man shook his head. Not tonight. Battery is done for. Ava watched the brief exchange before looking away. A minute later, she noticed the man sitting alone at the counter counting folded bills with visible concern. Ethan noticed her watching. What is it? He asked. Ava hesitated. Nothing. Ethan followed her gaze. The answer became obvious. He had already learned something important about Ava Bennett. Whenever she said nothing, it usually meant something. She opened her purse and quietly checked its contents. $23 had become less after coffee and food. She stared at the remaining bills. Then she looked toward the elderly man again. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched. Ava sighed softly and stood from the booth. Be right back. Ethan remained seated as she approached the counter. He could not hear the conversation clearly, but he saw enough. He saw the confusion on the man's face. He saw Ava smile. He saw her hand him several folded bills. The man immediately tried to refuse. Ava insisted. Eventually he accepted. A few moments later he shook her hand gratefully. When Ava returned to the booth, Ethan looked at her. You just gave away money you clearly need. She shrugged. He needed it more. Ethan stared at her for a moment. You do that often? Do what? Help strangers. Ava smiled faintly. My father used to say kindness is not something you save for when life becomes easy. She looked down at her coffee. Otherwise, most people would never get around to it. Ethan felt those words settle somewhere deep inside him. For years, he had sat in conference rooms listening to presentations about leadership, strategy, and growth. Yet somehow a tired woman sitting in a roadside diner had just delivered a lesson that felt more valuable than most of them. The storm continued fading outside. Snow still fell, but more gently now. The highway lights slowly reappeared through the darkness. The station manager walked past their booth carrying a radio. Roads should reopen within the hour, he announced. Several customers nodded with relief. Ava smiled. Looks like civilization survived after all. Ethan smiled back, but his attention remained on her. Throughout the evening, he had watched her choose generosity again and again. Not because anyone was watching. Not because she expected something in return. Simply because it was who she was. Most people treated kindness like a transaction. Ava treated it like a habit. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan found himself genuinely interested in another person's life. Not their title, not their connections, not what they could do for him, just them. Outside, the snow continued falling softly beneath the streetlights while somewhere beyond the diner windows, the future was already moving quietly toward them both. Shortly after 1 in the morning, the roads finally reopened. The station manager announced the update to the remaining customers, and a quiet sense of relief moved through the diner. Ava glanced at the clock and laughed softly. At this point, I think my interview outfit is officially going to be coffee, exhaustion, and determination. Ethan smiled as they stood from the booth. Determination might carry the other two. Outside, the storm had calmed considerably. Snow still covered everything, but the wind had faded, leaving the world strangely peaceful. Their breath drifted through the cold air as they walked back toward the disabled sedan. Ethan made a quick call and arranged roadside assistance. Within 20 minutes, a mechanic arrived and confirmed the issue was minor. Another half-hour later, they were back on the road. The city seemed different now. Quieter. Softer. Ava rested her head lightly against the seat and watched the sleeping neighborhoods pass by. The long evening should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt strangely natural. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Ethan glanced toward her. "For what?" "For stopping tonight from becoming a complete disaster. I think the weather deserves most of the credit." "No, the weather definitely made everything worse." Ethan laughed. "Fair point." Ava smiled and looked out the window again. For a moment, she wondered if she would ever see him after tonight. The thought surprised her more than she expected. Eventually, they reached her apartment building. It was an aging brick structure squeezed between two larger buildings on a quiet street. The front steps were covered in fresh snow. Ethan parked at the curb. Neither moved immediately. Somehow saying goodbye felt more difficult than it should have. "Well," Ava said softly, "this is me." Ethan nodded. "Good luck tomorrow." "Thank you." She reached for the door handle, then paused. "You know, technically I still owe you coffee." Ethan smiled. "That is true." Ava opened her purse and pulled out a receipt from the diner. She borrowed a pen from the center console and quickly wrote a phone number on the back. "In case our optimistic someday actually happens." Ethan accepted the receipt. For a brief second their eyes met. "I hope it does." Ava smiled before stepping out into the cold. She waved once from the sidewalk and disappeared through the building entrance. Ethan remained parked at the curb longer than necessary. The receipt rested in his hand. He looked down at the phone number written across the paper and felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Anticipation. Eventually, he drove away. Across town, he returned to a luxury penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city stretching endlessly into the darkness. The private elevator opened directly into his residence. A concierge greeted him by name. Ethan barely noticed. His mind remained elsewhere. On a snowstorm. A roadside diner. A woman carrying an old bus pass with two handwritten words on the back. "Keep going." The next morning arrived far too quickly for Ava. She woke after only a few hours of sleep and rushed through her routine. Despite the exhaustion, she felt oddly lighter than she had in weeks. Maybe because something about the previous night had reminded her that good people still existed. She arrived at the nonprofit office 10 minutes early. The building was modern but welcoming, filled with natural light and photographs of community projects. Ava took a deep breath and checked in at reception. The interview went better than she expected. The hiring manager seemed impressed by her experience and determination. For the first time in months, hope felt realistic. When the meeting ended, Ava stepped outside with a genuine smile. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. An unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello." "I was told determination carried the coffee and exhaustion." Ava stopped walking. The familiar voice instantly made her smile. "Ethan, good. I was worried you forgot me already. It has been less than 12 hours. Still, it is a competitive world." Ava laughed. People passing on the sidewalk glanced over as her mood visibly brightened. "The interview went well," she said. "I am not surprised. You sound very confident." "I told you. I am an optimistic person." She smiled at the memory. For the next several minutes, they talked as though they had known each other much longer than a single night. Neither noticed how naturally the conversation flowed. Neither realized that something important had already begun. But hundreds of miles away from the life Ethan usually revealed to the world, a board meeting had been rescheduled because of the storm. And within days, circumstances would place Ava directly in front of a truth Ethan had carefully hidden. A truth large enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about the man who shared a ride home with her through the snow. The following week passed faster than Ava expected. She received the call she had been hoping for. The nonprofit offered her the position. The salary was not life-changing, but it was enough to ease some of the pressure that had followed her for years. More importantly, it came with health benefits that would help her mother. For the first time in a long time, the future felt slightly less frightening. During those days, Ethan remained a constant presence in her life. They exchanged messages, shared coffee twice, talked on the phone more often than either intended. Every conversation felt easy, natural. Yet there was one thing Ava could never quite figure out. Ethan always seemed available, but somehow she knew very little about his actual work. Whenever she asked, He answered politely without saying much at all. The mystery should have bothered her. Instead, she found herself enjoying his company enough to ignore it. Then everything changed on a Thursday morning. Ava's new supervisor approached her desk carrying a folder. "Good news," she said. "We have been invited to attend a major community investment presentation this afternoon." Ava looked up. "What kind of presentation?" "One of the largest corporate foundations in Illinois is announcing a new outreach initiative." She handed Ava the folder. "This could lead to future partnerships. I would like you to come." Ava agreed immediately. By mid-afternoon, she found herself standing inside one of the most impressive conference centers she had ever seen. Glass walls overlooked the Chicago skyline. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Community leaders, nonprofit directors, journalists, and business executives moved through the crowd. Ava suddenly felt underdressed despite wearing her best outfit. "Take a breath," her supervisor whispered. "You belong here." Ava smiled nervously. Across the room, a massive screen displayed the logo of Carter Mobility Foundation. Something about the name felt familiar, though she could not place it. The lights gradually dimmed. Conversations faded. Guests took their seats. Ava settled into her chair and opened the event program resting on the table. Her eyes drifted toward the list of speakers. Then she froze. At the very top was a name. Ethan Carter. Her heartbeat stumbled. Ethan Carter. No, it could not be. There were probably thousands of Ethan Carters in America. She stared at the page again. Carter Mobility. Ethan Carter. A strange feeling began building inside her chest. Before she could process it, the announcer stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Mobility, chairman of the Carter Foundation, and one of the nation's leading philanthropists, Mr. Ethan Carter." The room erupted into applause. Ava felt the air leave her lungs. A man stepped onto the stage. The same dark hair, the same calm smile, the same eyes that had looked at her across a diner booth during a snowstorm. Ethan. Her Ethan. The man who claimed he was between jobs. The man who drove a modest rental car. The man who spoke about figuring things out. Ava stared in disbelief as hundreds of people rose to their feet. Some applauded enthusiastically. Others reached for phones to take photographs. Ethan stood beneath the spotlight with effortless confidence. Not nervous, not uncertain, not lost. He looked completely at home. Because this was his world. Ava barely heard the first several minutes of his speech. Her thoughts crashed into one another. Billionaire, CEO, national business leader, foundation chairman. Every title felt impossible. Every memory from the snowstorm suddenly looked different. The broken car, the vague answers, the carefully chosen words. Had any of it been real? Ethan's gaze moved across the audience as he spoke. Then it happened. He saw her. For the briefest moment, his composure shifted. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Ava noticed. His eyes widened slightly. The speech continued. The audience remained captivated. Yet neither of them was truly focused on the presentation anymore. Ava felt hurt in a way she could not fully explain. It was not his wealth. That part did not matter. What mattered was the omission. The secrets. The fact that she had shared pieces of her life while he had hidden something enormous. When the presentation finally ended, applause thundered through the hall. People immediately surged toward the stage hoping to speak with him. Ava stood abruptly. "Ava," her supervisor asked, "are you okay?" She forced a smile. "I just need some air." She turned and walked quickly toward the exit. Behind her, Ethan stepped away from a group of executives. His eyes followed her through the crowd. For the first time in years, a boardroom negotiation, a shareholder meeting, or a billion-dollar contract meant absolutely nothing. Because the only person he wanted to talk to was already walking away. Cold air greeted Ava the moment she stepped outside the conference center. The Chicago skyline shimmered beyond the glass towers, but she barely noticed it. Her thoughts were moving too fast. Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer, founder, philanthropist, one of the wealthiest men in the city. She replayed every conversation they had shared, every vague answer, every careful smile, every time he had changed the subject when she asked about work. The hurt was not about money. It was about trust. Her phone began vibrating before she even reached the sidewalk. Ethan. She stared at the screen until the call ended. A second later, another call appeared. Then a message. "Ava, please let me explain." She slipped the phone into her purse without answering. Across the street, traffic flowed steadily through the afternoon rush. Ava started walking. She needed distance. She needed time to think. For the next 2 days, she ignored every call and message. Ethan respected her silence, but it was not easy. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar agreements, solving corporate crises, and managing problems that affected thousands of employees. None of those experiences prepared him for being ignored by one woman whose opinion suddenly mattered more than he wanted to admit. On the third day, Ava left work and discovered a small envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of her car. No logo, no expensive stationery, just her name written across the front. Her pulse quickened immediately. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Ava, you have every right to be angry. I should have told you the truth sooner. I never lied about who I was as a person, but I did hide a large part of my life. For that, I am sorry. There is something I would like to show you. No speeches, no excuses, just the truth. If you decide not to come, I will understand. Ethan. Beneath the message was an address and a time. Saturday morning. Ava folded the note and placed it back into the envelope. Part of her wanted to throw it away. Another part remained curious. By Saturday, curiosity won. The address led her to a modest community center on the south side of Chicago. She expected a corporate event. Security guards, reporters, luxury vehicles. Instead, she found children reading in a renovated library room, while volunteers organized books along freshly painted shelves. Ethan stood near the entrance wearing jeans and a simple sweater. No audience, no cameras, no executives, just Ethan. When he saw her, relief crossed his face. Thank you for coming. Ava crossed her arms. You said no speeches. Ethan smiled faintly. Fair. He guided her through the building. Every room told a story. A computer lab, a tutoring center, a food pantry, a small medical clinic. The walls displayed photographs of families and volunteers. What is this place? Ava asked. One of our foundation projects. One of hundreds. Ethan nodded. Something like that. Ava looked around. Children laughed from a nearby room. An elderly volunteer waved as they passed. None of it felt staged. None of it felt designed for publicity. Eventually, Ethan stopped beside a framed photograph hanging in the hallway. It showed him years earlier standing beside an older couple. My parents, he said quietly. My father drove city buses for 27 years. Ava blinked in surprise. Ethan continued. My mother worked at a public library. For the first time since the reveal, she saw vulnerability in his expression. Real vulnerability. Everything I have today started because two ordinary people worked incredibly hard. He looked down briefly. After I became successful, I learned something unfortunate. The moment people recognized my name, they stopped treating me normally. Every conversation changed. Every interaction felt different. Ava listened without speaking. The night we met at the bus stop was supposed to be a break from all of that. I rented the car myself. I left my usual life behind for a few days. He smiled sadly. Then I met you. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. You should have told me, Ava said softly. I know. Every time I shared something personal, you already knew you were hiding a huge part of your life. Ethan nodded. You are right. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. That mattered more than Ava expected. Through a nearby window, she watched children carrying books between shelves. One little boy proudly held up a novel as if he had discovered treasure. The sight made her smile despite herself. Ethan noticed. There is one more thing I want to show you. Ava followed him outside. A short drive later, they arrived at a transit authority maintenance yard. Workers moved between parked buses while engineers studied maps and schedules. Ava looked confused. Why are we here? Ethan handed her a folder. She opened it slowly. Inside were project plans, funding agreements, and route maps. Then she saw a familiar street highlighted in blue. Her neighborhood. Her eyes widened as she read the title at the top of the page. The Bennett Route Community Transit Initiative. Ethan watched her reaction carefully. The city planned to eliminate the route because of budget cuts, he said. The same route your father drove for years. The same route you still depend on. Ava stared at the documents. Her throat tightened. You saved it? Ethan nodded. It seemed important. For a long moment, she could not speak. Because she suddenly understood something. Ethan had not been trying to impress her with wealth. He had been paying attention. To her stories. To her memories. To the things that mattered most. And that realization changed everything. For several moments, Ava simply stood there holding the folder while the sounds of the maintenance yard faded into the background. Workers moved between buses. Engines hummed in the distance. Yet all she could focus on was the realization that Ethan had listened to every story she shared. Not just listened, remembered. The route her father drove. The neighborhood she worried about. The people who depended on that transportation every day. Ethan had taken something that mattered deeply to her and protected it. Why? She finally asked. Ethan looked at her with quiet honesty. Because it mattered to you. Ava felt emotion tighten her throat. For weeks, she had convinced herself that Ethan's wealth was the problem, that his secrecy had erased everything good between them. Standing there now, she understood something different. The man she met during the snowstorm had been real. The kindness, the patience, the humor. None of those things had been an act. The only thing hidden was the size of the life he returned to afterward. Months passed. Spring slowly replaced winter across Chicago. Trees bloomed along city streets. The new transit initiative officially launched. Community leaders celebrated the preserved route. Families who depended on public transportation continued reaching jobs, schools, and appointments without disruption. Ava threw herself into her new position at the nonprofit. Ethan remained involved in foundation projects, but somehow they continued finding reasons to spend time together. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became weekend walks. Weekend walks became long conversations about dreams, fears, and everything in between. This time there were no secrets. Ethan answered questions honestly. Ava learned about the pressures of leadership, the loneliness that sometimes accompanied success, and the responsibility he felt toward thousands of employees. Ethan learned about her childhood memories, her hopes for the future, and her determination to build a life filled with purpose rather than possessions. The closer they became, the more obvious one truth grew. Their connection had never depended on wealth. It had started with a missed bus, a shared ride, and two people choosing kindness. 1 year later, on a warm autumn afternoon, Ava received an invitation from Ethan asking her to meet him downtown. The location surprised her. It was one of the city's oldest transit stations, recently renovated as part of a community project. Curious, she arrived just before sunset. Golden light streamed through the station windows. Families moved through the terminal while commuters hurried toward platforms. Ethan waited near the center of the building. "You are smiling," Ava said as she approached. "That usually means you are planning something." "Maybe." He offered his hand. "Come with me." Together, they walked toward a small exhibit space that had been created inside the station. Ava stopped when she saw what stood in the center. Encased in glass was an old laminated bus pass. Her bus pass, the one she carried every day. The one her father had given her years ago. Ava stared at it in disbelief. "How did you?" Ethan smiled. "Your mother helped." Tears immediately filled Ava's eyes. Beneath the display was a simple plaque. "Keep going." The words appeared exactly as her father had written them. Ava touched her fingertips to her lips. "Ethan." He stepped closer. "That night at the bus stop, you thought those words helped you survive difficult years." His voice softened. "What you never realized is that you gave those same words to everyone around you. Your mother, your coworkers, complete strangers, even me." Ava felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Ethan reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded a small piece of paper. It was the receipt from the diner. The same receipt where she had written her phone number on the night they met. "I kept this," he said, "because it reminds me of the moment my life changed." The station seemed to disappear around them. The crowd, the noise, everything faded until only the two of them remained. Ethan took a slow breath. "I spent years building companies, projects, and plans for the future. Then one snowstorm changed all of them." He smiled gently. "Because I met a woman who reminded me what matters most." He knelt down on one knee. Ava covered her mouth. "Ava Bennett, will you keep going through life with me?" For a moment she could not speak. She laughed through tears and nodded repeatedly. "Yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger as applause erupted from nearby travelers who had quietly gathered around the scene. Ava immediately pulled him into a hug. Above them, sunlight streamed through the station windows, casting warm light across the old bus pass and the words that had carried her through so many years. "Keep going." Later that evening, another line was added beneath the display. Simple, honest, perfect, together.